All right, so for this week, we're going to touch on something that's been getting thrown around again in kind of the social or strength coaches social media network. So this one will definitely be more governed towards the coaching population. But the term we're going to look at tonight is self-organization and how this has kind of a multitude of definitions. And there's often a miscommunication or a mismatch with the semantics of this. And then how coaches kind of go into debates based on different points, thinking that they're talking about the same thing. But for our context tonight, we're going to take a look at just how self-organization is rooted in human biology in and of itself, and then stepping away from there, looking at self-organizing in terms of movement production, technique, skill orientation, and then touch on some, kind of self-organizing topics and with regard to injury management and return to play. So kicking it off this evening, self-organization is something that is inherently present with human nature, right? Everything in terms of human biology is driven by not dying, reproducing, and staying at equilibrium or finding equilibrium. So it's inherently about balance. There are a number of systems that are constantly at play and fluctuating things, levels, pressures, contractions, all these different things that are occurring in the body at all times. There's constant turnover and constant regeneration. So when we look at self-organization on a very, very macro 10,000 foot scale, self-organization is in our nature. Now, when we transition the term and apply it to human movement, this is the debate that coaches tend to get into with regard to doing something a certain way or doing something an optimal way based on the mechanics of the movement. So an easy example being the false step pattern for wide receivers, right? Everybody started getting bent out of shape with that false step. And then we started looking more at the data and the numbers behind it, and that clearly show that a false step produces faster, higher, greater acceleration, higher short-term velocities, and then being able to initiate or change direction. So I think the biggest thing to consider with this is what type of athletes are you working with? What is the objectives of their sport? And then what are their independent limitations? So let's use a weightlifter for a more practical example here. Weightlifters who have hypermobile joints, how does that manifest in the movements and in the training process?
I know for me personally, my elbows hyperextend. So that was something that I had to be very cognizant of when I'm catching overhead in the snatch or the jerk, because if I'm not in a correct position overhead, I can press out, my elbow will just shoot back. And that's one of the more common injuries that you can have. But a big thing, not even going off of mobility versus stability, but even just the biomechanics of different lifters. Asian lifters are going to have a different start position or setup versus American lifters versus Russian lifters because of their limb length and torso height and things like that. So you're looking at things from that perspective as well.
So, and here's a good one for you. Another one that we see all the time is asymmetries, right? Yeah. So rotational athletes or throwing athletes, we can pick on them because they're easiest, but this asymmetrical development is an example of self-organization. The body developing hypertrophy at certain muscles in certain regions to protect and to optimize their specific demands of sport. Same thing with the joint capsules and then the densification of fascia. I mean, we can go on and on. Right. But when we look at this and we're thinking about, kind of that return to play shit, what is present in your mind?
I think, well, again, it goes back to what their sport is. But let's go back to a thrower. I mean, if I'm doing an extensive rehab where they're out for how many months because of a surgery, I mean, there's still going to be these asymmetries present. And, everyone wants to look at this has to be equal to this, or this paraspinal isn't equal to that. But then it's to me, it doesn't matter, because if we're talking about self-organization here, yes, asymmetries are, to me, very intelligent, self-organization pieces that your body will just gravitate towards, because now that is kind of your homeostasis. So it's super simple stuff and nothing different. I'm just looking at your strength, your range of motion, your just ability to produce any kind of force within an awkward kind of plane of motion, because you're going to have to deal with that stuff. And
to
me, it's if you don't have those asymmetries, or are you playing enough, or do you actually have a command of your position you're at? Because a pitcher, you're going to have that GERD kind of deficit, but that's okay, because again, going back to you, your body's trying to protect the elbow, the shoulder, your thoracic rotation, all that kind of stuff. And it's just a simple thing of just I hate to say it, but correcting or giving the other side a chance to kind of catch up. So we're not like, simply just throwing a fucking dumbbell as a pitch, you know what I mean? So it's, it's nothing sexy, no sexy answer about it.
Yeah.
One thing I think about a lot too is Eric Cressy's like sturdy shoulders. He always shows like a lot of his baseball pitchers preseason, and then once he gets them postseason, and he basically spends that entire offseason working to kind of redistribute and fix some of those asymmetries. But even when you see them getting ready to head back for the next season, those they're never perfectly symmetrical. There's still going to be, a little bit of an asymmetry, but it's just kind of closing that gap in a little bit because they're no longer in that, in that season to play the sport. So their body doesn't need as much of a demand of that asymmetry.
Yeah. So to, I guess, put my 2 cents in on asymmetries. You mentioned it at the top. You're like, I don't really care. I agree. The way I look at it is I don't care about it until I have to or until I'm prompted to, because there's going to be a tipping point where that margin of difference, whether it be anterior to posterior or left to right, is going to be, an increased vulnerability for injury. It is going to start to compromise performance. It is going to start to take away from, any sort of optimal mechanics. So really it just becomes about governing the margin between the two, not necessarily trying to singularly improve one or the other, I think. But with the, heavily unilateral based athletes, this is, something that's going to affect anything else. So gait pattern, resting posture, the way they're sleeping, right? So again, we get back to this root of self-organization, and it's like, how much of that do we interfere with when we're doing something like a lunge or an overhead press or, a sled push? When you have that strong of a left to right balance, is this something that just self-organizes?
I think it could be, it's a different answer with different people. I mean, when I'm just based off that, when I'm thinking of kind of that stuff, it's like, again, I'm not worrying about it until I have to worry about it, because I mean, you could spend like fucking hours trying to do all this like prehabilitative work or prehab, but then it's like, that might be taken away from actually like more important stuff, like actually getting better. And to that thought, it's like just being good at the basics, going back to the basics, not having to do all this like fancy stuff. I mean, making sure you can still press healthy overhead, press horizontally, turn healthy without any pain, making sure that we're kind of mitigating any chances of like impingements in like the shoulders or hips, making sure like the back is healthy, and being very good at the basics, but then just keeping in mind that like recovery, just to kind of re-engrave those basics and make sure the basics are keeping us healthy. Because I mean, you can't like recover retroactively. So I think that'll be your best bet in terms of like the prehab stuff. So because again, like you have so many joints and complexes in the body, you can spend like waste time on just prehab stuff. Like let your body again just intelligently self-organize and just kind of like focus on the more important stuff.
And on the coach's end of that, I think it's an equal reciprocity where you need to be the coach until you kind of just need to back away and let shit happen for itself. I think that's something that's actually, underutilized in terms of strategies for coaching. But a lot of the times, man, we can just overhammer, overcue, and overdrill certain things that, if nothing else, aren't doing anything productive for the athlete. So it goes back to, again, wasting time. But I actually have had a question that's probably best suited for Nicole. At what point of an athlete's development does that really start to become a pressing thought? Because the way I look at it is when they're super young, so like under 14, under 12, whatever, man. Mm-hmm. Very basic, broad parameters, and then just go have fun.
Yep.
Yeah.
And from 14 to 20, 21, very strict on what the movement that we're looking for and how to execute it is. So then at what point at their development does it start to revert back to like, all right, like I'm just here so you don't do anything egregiously wrong?
I mean, it's obviously, so that's very much athlete dependent, of course. But it's when you start looking at, especially for Olympic weightlifting, when you're looking at the technique and the breakdown, if the athlete is hitting a plateau, so they can't seem to get past a certain number because they are doing something funky or they have a weird kind of movement pattern or compensation for something. And so you need to try to figure out how we're going to get over that hump. And maybe that now we got to step in and mess with the technique a little bit more and things like that. But, when it comes to high level athletes and high level lifters, they may not have, pristine, perfect technique. Every single one of them is going to lift differently in one way, shape, or form. But if they're getting ready to, walk on the platform in Tokyo, you're not about to mess with their technique and fuck with any of that. So it depends. But I think it's really a matter of athlete safety. If they're looking like something is going to cause an injury or become a hindrance. A lot of like triple extension is a really good one. We see a lot of people kind of hyperextend in that back, and that's how they really try to work to get the bar up. And some people can do it without the bar kicking out away from them. But over time, if they're starting to really experience a lot of low back pain, it's, you know, kind of nagging here and there, that's kind of a red flag to be like, all right, we need to make this pull a little bit more vertical, take it out of the back a little bit to avoid any serious injuries down the line.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a guy right now, it's like, I'm not really coaching him. I'm kind of just being there to make sure he doesn't like fuck up in a macro scale. But it's like, again, just like let the lifters lift. Yeah. And then over time, if you're trusting the program, it should kind of self-organize, I guess you could say, throughout that cycle. You know what I mean? And I mean, that's the point of cycles. It's like, you can work on some certain stuff, you can try to gain strength, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, the body's going to do what the body's going to do. I mean, I have, you know, a couple lifters now that sometimes they don't hit triple extension, but they're still slinging weight around.
Yeah.
You know, like, okay, but everything on the other boxes check out. Their backs aren't rounding, everything's straight. First position's good, you know, blah, blah, blah. And again, you can just work on those little things over time. And it's the body's smart enough to tell you whether or not it's going to kind of get hurt or not.
Absolutely.
I think.
And I think too, kind of going along with that from a technique and learning the lift standpoints, a lot of times new coaches will be like, well, how do you know what to look for when you're working with an athlete? Like, how do you know what to correct first? And you want to kind of look at the big, like egregious, like thing that stands out.
What you see first.
Right.
Yeah.
But a lot of times when you fix that one thing, a lot of other things will start to fall into place naturally because the body will reorganize itself and allow some other technical flaws to clean themselves up that you then don't have to go in and like beat with a dead horse. And then you can kind of just keep rolling from there.
I'm pretty sure you beat a dead horse. You don't beat with a dead horse, but
I do.
I'm gonna blame the technique.
That's my technique. But I mean, like, so to that point, it's like I remember working with this one guy, and all we worked on for a couple of weeks was on his first position. As he was pulling up on a snatch, I'm like, dude, just push your knees out, control it. And then from there, after like how many weeks, he kind of just felt it. He felt like just loading up the hips. And then right there, the second pull corrected itself, like jumping straight up and all that stuff. And I was like, so from that kind of self-organization, you now have like this mindfulness of like how one thing's supposed to feel, and then it cascades into another thing. So
absolutely,
that's perfect. It's exactly what I was going to finish with. And that's, I think that, and I know this is very much against or whatever, but I think that technique and coaching technique and drilling is overzealous, broadly speaking. I think it's overdone. I think that we've underutilized or underemphasized like athlete and coach intuition and just kind of getting this like rhythm with your training, and then the relationship or the dialogue between the coach and the athlete. You know, things should just kind of be a lot more natural, where there are very obvious rights and wrongs that shouldn't need to be, you know, hammered over and over again. And then I think both in terms of like auto regulation, load management, you know, accessory work, all these different things, I think it can be much more of a, you know, intuitively led endeavor, as opposed to it needing to be, you know, so zealous about technique.
Well, I think that's how the athlete develops the best over time. They have to learn to feel it within their body themselves, versus just every time they do something, turning and looking at their coach and be like, is that right? Was that it?
Yeah.
Start to understand what it should feel like in their body.
Right.
I agree. No, 100%. Perfect.